Good afternoon, and welcome to Black Cambridge and COVID-19, a five-part series being hosted by myself, Vice Chair Manikka Bowman of the Cambridge School Committee, and City Councilor and former Mayor Denise Simmons. We're going to give it about maybe 1 minute or so to allow other people to enter the conversation via Zoom, and then we'll get started with our program. Okay, we've hit the 1 minute mark, and I think we're ready to start our conversation, this much needed conversation today. As I said, this is a five-part series, and the first part of our series will deal with education, and I am elated and excited to be joined by our panel, which include Manuel Fernandez, principal at the Cambridge Street Upper School, Lavette Curry, a parent at the Fletcher Maynard Academy, as well as the managing director for the KIPP Schools, Massachusetts, Sean Brown, who is the executive director of Becoming a Man, and my colleague, Aisha Wilson, who is on our school committee, as well as work for the Cambridge Workforce Program. Welcome to our panel. As we start this program, I want to pull up a map to make it very clear and visual, the impact that COVID-19 is having on minority communities. We're prepping the map now for you to see. If you look in at this map, it's crystal clear that minority Cambridge, specifically Black Cambridge, is being impacted greatly by COVID-19. You'll see the Cambridge Port, East Cambridge, and North Cambridge, where I live. And data shows that Black Cambridge is 3 times more likely to contract COVID-19 than than white residents in the city. We know that Cambridge is a liberal community, and we pride ourselves on being very progressive. Is one of the reasons why I chose to be a part of this community and live in this community and raise my children in this community. But we are just like any other American city when it comes to dealing with structural racism and inequalities that traditionally impact particularly Black communities, but minority communities in general. And so that's the conversation that we need to have today. Although we are, progressive in nature, there are still areas of growth that we need to have and conversations that center the experience of Black people in this city. And I am elated to be doing this with my colleague and my friend, Denise Simmons. Denise?
Thank you, Manikka, our school committee woman, Manikka Bowman. I am so pleased to be here with you, and I want to thank the speakers and our audience that are viewing in. If this series, this five-part series, could have a coined phrase, it would be, if every hand that reach could touch. And that's what we're trying to do. We're really trying to reach out and touch our community, the Black community, African-American community in particular, because of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it is affecting our community. As you know, that the idea here is to develop strategies and have a conversation about how we can best protect ourselves and our loved ones. You've seen data coming out of the Cambridge Health Department that tells us that Black people in Cambridge are 3 times more likely to be infected by the COVID-19 virus than the rest of the Cambridge population. This is due to everything from underlying pre-existing health problems, access to good health care, being essential workers, and being exposed unnecessarily, I believe, in sometimes, to illness and harm. So I am just so pleased that we have this opportunity to have this conversation. I have my pen ready and a piece of paper to take notes, but if you don't, I believe this is being taped, so you'll be able to see it another time. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, listening. And to my colleague, I turn it back to you. I'm waiting to hear this riveting conversation to these wonderful individuals that will be speaking this afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Councilor Simmons. So what does this all mean in the context of education and our families? What does COVID-19 mean for Black families and Black children in the context of already having to be a part of a system that historically, in general, we know that public education has always been a challenge for Black families. We have always had to fight and advocate to get equity in education, parity in education when it comes to our children. And so many families, including myself and parents, have a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety around the implications of this from a psychological perspective, but as well as an academic perspective and the impact that this will have on our kids from a systematic perspective. And so we're going to start the conversation now. So one of the first questions that I would like to pose to our panel is, you know, we all touch the Cambridge public school system, or even charter school systems for that matter, from different vantage points. So I'm just curious, what are you seeing, and how is COVID-19 impacting our families? And we're going to start with Principal Hernandez.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I'm honored to be with you today. What does it mean for children during this period, particularly Black children? It means a high level of anxiety. It means a disconnection from people and peers that they are used to being with and looking forward to seeing on a regular day. It means worried about mom and dad and caregivers who are essential workers who need to be out every day. It's about scholars who may be on individual education plans who are unable to have regular access to a special educator because it's very difficult to teach an individual education plan over a remote learning. So there's a high level of anxiety. There's a high level of concern. What is the outcome? Well, we see disengagement. We see disengagement around the academic responsibilities, which means whatever slide that is going to affect generally is going to affect at a higher percentage scholars on IEPs or scholars of color who traditionally are disengaged from school. We like to think that we're a school that responds to all of our scholars, and we've worked very hard. We've created Cobra Dens to which is a Cobra is our mascot, is a small advisory that meets regularly so that we can engage some of our all of our scholars and give them a formal connection. We find that scholars who are not engaging in the work do show up for the advisory, do show up for the den because they want to be connected. They need that social emotional relationship. So one of the things they say about any type of virus or flu, you know, those of us who grew up in the Black community know when everybody else gets a cold, we got the flu. Okay, well, in this particular case, we have the flu isn't just about being ill. It's about being sad. It's about being disconnected. It's about being hungry. And so we're not just hungry for food, we are hungry for connection. And that's what we're seeing with our young people. And we're working very hard to respond to that, but it is a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Sean, what are you seeing with your program, Becoming a Man?
Thank you. First, thank you, Manikka. It's a pleasure to join you all today. As Councilor Simmons said earlier, you know, COVID-19 is having disproportionate impact on our communities, Black and Brown communities, which is primarily the communities we serve. The virus is hitting hard in these communities because many of our family make up the frontline workers who are working in the grocery stores, delivering food, operating public transit, which leaves them more exposed to the virus. When COVID-19 first hit, we saw a lot of confusion and uncertainty. No one really knew what was going on. No one knew what was real or what was fake as it pertained to the virus. And we heard this directly from our scholars who were being educated by what they were seeing on social media. Scholars were making reference to memes on social media saying Black people can't catch the virus, we're immune to it for silly reasons. And for many of our young people, it was a joke in the beginning until it started to hit home for many of them, as well as some adults in some cases, loved ones being sick, impacted by the virus, made folks realize that, this isn't a game. It was traumatizing. We're seeing the toll that it's having on the mental health of our scholars and their families. And that was something that we addressed immediately. For us, we stopped everything, immediately met, our scholars where they were. It wasn't about curriculum. It was about listening, reestablishing a safe container that was established during the school year for our scholars. So what was important was reestablishing that trust and safe space, because what we were hearing were our scholars were scared. They were frustrated. They were angry. A lot of the things that, Mr. Fernandez, spoke to is what we were hearing from our scholars. So our sole focus during that time was really, how do we support the mental health of our scholars? So, 4 things that really highlight that we were seeing was, family members getting sick, the impact that was having on the mental health. We're seeing scholars taking on greater responsibility. They're becoming caretakers and the financial providers for their families, on top of having to be students. Scholars are having to make tough choices. When I say tough choices, meaning grown-up choices. We've had a scholar whose both his parents have tested positive for the virus, as well as his sister, who also has a child, who he's now become the caretaker of. He said something that he said to us is every day he wakes up and he's faced with a decision. Or he has to make a choice. Is he going to take care of his family, or is he going to, do his schoolwork? And that's tough on a 16, 17-year-old to have to make that decision. So that ties into something else that we heard from our scholars. And that is educators have this misconception that young people have all this time on their hands, which is the furthest from the truth. We're also seeing the economic hardships COVID-19 is having on Black families. Parents being laid off, furloughed, laid off and things of that nature. So that's some of the things that we're hearing from our scholars during this time.
Thank you, Sean. Member Wilson, what are you hearing? You have a really unique perspective as it relates to the educational system with your work with the workforce program, as well as now being a member of the school committee, newly minted member of our school committee. What are you hearing?
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair Bowman and Councilor Simmons for having this event and for having me. I think just to echo what Sean mentioned, as well as Mr. Fernandez, around the worry, the fear, the anxiety of what many of our young people are facing, experiencing, as well as their families. We know that for the Housing Authority, we work with and service many families that are first generation families, immigrant families who are new to this country. And some of the fears and the anxieties that they're having, I remember in the first couple of weeks of just, like Sean mentioned, just being there, just creating the space for our scholars to just come in and be in community, not building on curriculum, but just building in community and just checking in and seeing how they're doing. And to hear week 2, week 3, that many of our scholars hadn't even been outside because of the fear that their families are having, and understanding that that is real. And so when we're talking about food insecurity and other challenges that they're experiencing, and knowing that there are sites where families can go and get food, that was the concern. I don't want to leave out of my house, right? I'm scared. And so, how do we ensure their feelings? How do we empathize with them when they're going through such realness? And we ourselves are also going through that as well, right? I don't have an answer for you. I don't know how to comfort you in this time, but I know that I'm in it with you and that we can kind of do this together. And so I think the first stages for us was just to be there and create space, and then see what were the needs of our families and identify that, and kind of resource out and just say, these are the programs. Food for Free are doing these things. The Cambridge Public Schools, there's the 8 locations where our scholars can go and get meals, our families could get meals. And then when the Mayor's Disaster Relief Fund hit, it was a huge blast for us to share out to our families, as well as other community foundations and organizations that also had financial relief services for our families. And I think something that Sean mentioned that is essential is, in addition to being those frontline workers, many of our families work in the healthcare systems, right? And so being that front line and going into work each and every day and knowing that they're putting their lives on the line and then coming back home to our children, to our scholars, is just, really heightened the level of our young people's decision making each and every day, right? So when they know that their parents are gone for 10 to 12 hours a day, they're up throughout that time, or maybe they're asleep during that time. And so we understand the sleeping patterns that really challenge our young people to wanting to engage academically. So for them, they would, they'll come to workforce, they'll want to engage. And then when I say, hey, well, how was your day? Did you log on into your, your Google Classroom or whatever? And they'll be like, yeah, no, I wasn't ready for that. And then we had to unpack that as a group. And how many of the young scholars that I had in my session to say, I wasn't ready to join in, and what are those fears that they're experiencing? And, and it's really just about, it doesn't feel the same. Being in person and being on a Google Classroom kind of thing is just not the same feeling. And so again, how do we comfort them during that time? How do we see them? How do we really be there, but also encourage them that that's an important space to also be in, right? The community space of like workforce is great, and I'm happy to see them each and every week. But understanding that their classroom space, their peers, their teacher, that's a valuable space for them to also be engaged and get that nurturing, get the worries and the fears kind of out of them, because they'll be able to also see their peers who are also going through this, as well as their educator who's being challenged with this pandemic as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we're trying as a school district and as a community, how do you keep people connected when when the whole purpose of this pandemic to stop it from spreading is like this whole piece of social distancing. And I really appreciate medical professionals really trying to shift that to say more it's physical distance, not necessarily the socially distancing piece of it, which is really important, how we use language. Lavette, you're a parent. You also work for our charter schools with KIPP. Tell me, what are you seeing?
So first, as a parent, I'm a parent of young children. So I have elementary school age children. And as a parent, my children were very unsure and their classmates were unsure and, trying to understand what was going on and what that meant. I think also with younger children, there's also a different like, hey, we get to stay at home and we get to be with mom or whoever. And there's a little bit of excitement that started off early on that is wearing off as this continues on. But I think also as a parent, I really appreciated the time that the district took early on to just check in and make sure everyone's okay, to provide the resources that families in our community needed. And I think that was time and energy that was well spent. But I also think we have to make sure that we're setting our children up for success when we get to the next phase of this, because this is temporary. And what I worry about as a parent is, are we losing sight of the temporary nature of this, and that our children will be further behind because we aren't necessarily doing the things that we need to do to try to at least keep some of the academic momentum going for our children, and that it's not necessarily one size fits all. It's usually one size fits none. And we are trying to, all of our families are in different places and experiencing this in different ways. And what are the things that we can do as a community to meet people where they are? How can we provide things that people can sort of take and leave as they're able mentally and physically to be able to do, and not like provide nothing because we are operating from a place that, nobody can handle this. And I think there are many families who are accessing a lot of things and a lot of resources for their children that some of the children in our community may not have access to. And so if Cambridge is not providing those things and putting those resources at the forefront, then it's just kids in our communities who don't have access to that, who are missing out, and everybody else is moving ahead. So you're going to have a cohort of children who come back, who have been taking advanced classes online, who've been doing all of these different things. Parents are starting co-op groups among themselves and taking experts from different fields and teaching their children. And if the district doesn't provide those kinds of resources for people to access in a similar way that they're providing food and mental health services and housing support that people can access if they need, and if they don't need, they don't have to access, I haven't seen that same push in terms of the variety of academic access, which is the primary purpose of our schools. You have to teach to the whole child, and you want to meet people where they are, but we can't lose sight of the academic responsibilities of everyone in this time period, because, you know, it's not 2 or 3 weeks or a month. It's going to be a significant amount of time, and we're still unsure of what the fall looks like. So we have to be prepared to shift the paradigm and think about what's available, because as a parent, I also want to make sure that my children are healthy and are able to navigate all this uncertainty and deal with those challenges. But I also want to make sure that they understand these standards, because 3 years from now, when we are past this, or 5 years from now, when we're past this, or when they're trying to go to college, they're going to be held to the same standard. It's not like they're going to shift the standard lower. And so what I am concerned about as a community, particularly as the Black community, is that our families have an opportunity to continue to, as much as they're able, to work with their children to make sure that they have what they need, not only mentally, socially, emotionally, but academically, so that they don't end up further behind. Because even when they were in classes in person, they weren't getting all things. And so now, if you think about the availability of technology, how can we utilize this opportunity to rethink how we are educating our children in our communities to get them more of what they need, while we have a voice and people are thinking about how to do things differently?
Yeah, I think that what you tapped on is a inherent tension that probably every school district across the country right now is dealing with, and particularly the Black community is dealing with. Anyone that has tried to establish themselves in the world, particularly in a Black body, knows how incredibly hard it is compared to other ethnic groups. And so in this moment, how do you manage and balance the trauma that is very real, that is impacting our families, with this thing that we know as people of color, as African American people, that we have to work twice as hard, 3 times as hard to get half as much sometimes. That's a very real thing that we grapple with in our community. So my question is, when it comes to, the academics and the social, emotional, and mental health of our kids and our families during this time, is this a both and conversation, or is it an either or? Because a lot of times I think we have the conversation from either or, but what does it look like from a both and perspective with dealing with the mental health piece, as well as recognizing that tapping into the imagination of our scholars is just really important still, even in the time of a pandemic. So, I'll go to Sean. What are you thinking about that conversation, that inherent tension?
Thank you. Great question. I think for learning to occur, scholars don't just need a physical safe space, which is what CDC guidelines speak to, but they also need a social and emotional safe space. It goes to, talking, going back to, what I referred to earlier when COVID first hit, was recreating that safe space for our scholars to have conversations with their BAM counselors. In a time of uncertainty, the one person they did feel comfortable speaking to was their BAM counselor, and you contribute that to the safe space that was created during the school year. That safe container where these young men can come in and have those conversations that they weren't able to have in the classroom. So that space, is important during this time. Who are those champions, for our young people. And, what was important for BAM was not only having that space with the BAM counselor, how do we create that space now in this new norm of with the teachers? So it was about, working collaboratively with the districts and bringing teachers and leaderships together to hear from our young people. What are what are you feeling right now? What is your space? When you start to talk about, and I think about what I said earlier around the misconception of all this time, teachers needed to hear that from young people. They needed to hear what our young people was going, through at home, because they weren't privy to that for whatever reason. So being able to provide that space, and then also being able to sit at, on the district equity roundtable discussions, and hear from them and bring this to the district level. Here's what we're hearing from families now. How do we break down the silos and have everyone come work together and hear what our young people and families are experiencing, and how we can support them. So just that social, emotional safe space was important, and has had a huge impact on our scholars, feeling better emotionally and from a mental standpoint during this time.
Principal Fernandez, I know that, you're really at the ground with this when you're working with your educators and your scholars. And I know one thing that the district, from a policy perspective, put in place was making sure that they had a combination of pre-recorded academic lessons that families and people can access on their own time frame, recognizing those inequities of having everything in the district happen, in real time. And, a person and a scholar has to sit down in front of a laptop and do it, between 1 and 2. Like, there's an inequity in that. But the work that you're doing, you're having to manage the both and in a very different way. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you're balancing these two tensions?
Sure. First, I want to say that I'm listening to what's going on in the community. One of the things that this pandemic has done is lifted up the voices of people who have not always been heard or have been ignored. The Cambridge Family of Color Coalition, My Brother's Keeper, Building Equity Bridges, NAACP, these voices are finally being heard. And I go to them regularly. I attend their meetings. I listen. I don't go there to present, so I can bring back. We are holding listening conferences in June with families, so that a child and their caregiver will meet with an advisor. What worked? What didn't work? What would you like to see in the fall? Whether we're in the building or we're not in the building, what can we do differently? So we ask a lot of questions, and then we try to put things into place that are supportive, and we ask that you judge us on that, and not judge us and like, that didn't work, I'm not talking to you anymore. No, that's not working for us. We need a differentiated approach. The same way we have differentiated instruction, we need differentiated family engagement. One of the things that we're learning just from the staff, we recently recorded, we'll be sharing with school committee members soon, we recently recorded a roundtable of just teachers talking about, in our building, what's working, what isn't working, so that we can share that with you to let you know what we've been doing, but we can also be informed by our own experiences. So as we move forward, we recognize, and I think Sean said this quite clearly, and I think Ms. Curry said it as well earlier, you can't teach if you're not feeling it. You can't teach if you can't connect. You can't learn if you don't have any sense of how does this make a difference in my life right now? I mean, we're trying to get food, and like Member Wilson said, we want food. We know that they're giving it out at XYZ school, but I'm not going out to go get that. So I think the district officials, school officials, city officials need to really tap into what people are saying. And there are a variety of ways. The superintendent just did a survey, so we are gathering information from that. But a lot of folks in some communities, including our own, are not going to go online and fill out a survey. They want to have a conversation. They want to talk to you in the same way that we use our community engagement team to deal with other issues. This is prime issue for them to be able to talk with people who are comfortable talking to them, to bring back to us what we need to be doing as we move into September. And believe me, we're all thinking about it and we're all pondering it. We need to be realistic about what's going to work for some and what might not work for others.
Yeah. I think it's this interesting tension where, there's this diversity of experiences that's happening across Black families, right? And so you have some, families that you have a person in the household, whoever that person is, to say, okay, I know it's a hard time to work through the social emotional pieces with their child, and then help them pivot to at least experiencing some type of academic engagement. And most people that I talk to, no one's following day to day the curriculum because it's just hard, and we're all in a pandemic. We're all trying to survive it. But I think that people are using these the tools that the district sends out as resources, which makes sense, because we're all living through this highly stressed time. And so I guess my question, and I'll kick this to Member Wilson as well as Councilor Simmons, is, how do we then connect into those families that may not have that one person at home that can help them leverage what the district is, providing to their kids? Because before the pandemic, unless we could leverage programs like many of the ones that was mentioned before, like Becoming a Man, to be able to fill those gaps. We can't do that now because we have to be physically distanced from each other. So, Member Wilson, Councilor Simmons, how do we fill those gaps with that particular cohort of individuals within the Black community?
Thank you, Vice Chair. I think the challenge here for the most part is that talking about mental health in our families, in Black families, is a taboo, right? We don't talk about mental health as a thing that needs support, that needs fixing, if you would. And so because of that, when we have children who are isolating themselves and dealing with the challenges in which they are, no one is doing that mental health check for our kids. No one in the household is really being mindful of what that may look like. And I think it's becoming more and more of a new thing, right? It's becoming more and more of a trend to think about my mental health and what the social emotional learning look like, and which is real. And I'm proud that that's becoming more and more of a focal point for our families, Black families, and then trickling it down to our kids so that our young people have the language of being able to say, I am feeling X when this is happening, or I am feeling Y while this is happening. And that's really important because their mental well-being, just like you go in for your doctor's visits, once a year, or your dentist appointments twice a year, you need to go in for your mental health check as often as you need to, and that's important. We need to have a therapist on our team, just like we have our doctors and our dentists on our teams. And so I think that that's point one. And I just want to say that as a school committee member, we put in a motion, myself, Member Rachel, and the mayor, about having those touch points for our schools, making sure that our teachers, that there is some outside non-academic engagement that's happening with our families at least once a week. There are other districts that are doing this 2 and 3 times a week in terms of checking in to see how our young people are doing. That doesn't require a huge, heavy lift. And we know that there are schools that are doing this. Mr. Fernandez, your school is doing a fantastic job at touching our kids and having those advisory case management kind of loads where kids are getting that, families are getting that, and understanding like it's not just about how you're doing academically, it's how are you doing? Because your needs, the hierarchy, Maslow hierarchy of needs, if your basic needs are not being met, you're not going to be able to show up in a classroom or show up anywhere and be well. And so those kinds of points are really important and critical. And that's why when we put in that motion, that was really the premise of it. That was the spirit of it, was that we know that young people might be showing up in a Zoom room, a Google Classroom, or whatever, but how are they doing honestly on the inside, and how is their families doing? Because if that's not all the way checked and together, that young person's only showing up just for the sake of going through the motion.
Yeah.
And that's not really meeting our young people where they are. And so I really just felt that it's really important that we're doing that and understanding that what high engagement may be just because they show up all the time is not that they are in good spirits behind those that computer screen, you know, and that it's really important that as a school committee member and really working with our district, working with our administration, working with our principals and our teachers, that we really see the value in that next step in understanding that this is a critical component, especially for the Black community, because for the most part, our young people are never seen, right? Our scholars never feel seen in the classrooms. They don't feel heard. They don't have those connections. They don't have valuable relationships in our schools. They have it maybe outside of, you know, in our community partnership programs or what have you, but that's not enough when they need it to then show up on that Google Classroom and actually learn. So relationships are powerful. Their social emotional well-being is necessary, is essential. And it's really important that as a school committee member that I'm uplifting those voices, because many of our families feel as though that's not being heard, seen, or respected.
No, absolutely. And, Councilor Simmons, like, how do you see this intersection, you know, this tension really building off of what Member Wilson said?
You know, first of all, I'm in lockstep with Member Wilson and what she had to say. But the very interesting thing is, and there's actually a question that's kind of in the question queue that kind of speaks to this. We have this new problem, and we haven't solved the old problem. And one of our old problems is, how do we get and reach everyone? We have a city that is resource rich, but we cannot manage to get everyone. And I shouldn't say that. We are not good at it when there are people that do it well. Mr. Fernandez, Ms. Harris, excellent at reaching out to the communities. Getting to the communities of color in particular is not easy work. And sometimes we get daunted by that. But those that stick to it, that make that one-to-one connection, make people feel valued, find ways to, on a regular basis, reach people to make sure that they're connected, is how we turn this around. We have to be far better at that. So while we look at this new problem, we have to look at why we haven't done it thus far. You know, we often talk about, well, we need to get on the internet and make sure we push the information out to the families. When a lot of the families, particularly in the port where I live, don't have access to good municipal, we have no municipal broadband, which we'll talk about in one of the series, but we don't have a good way. All the households don't have access to technology.
And, you know, can I jump in right quick, Mayor Simmons?
Absolutely.
I really appreciate you saying that, because a lot of times when people come to our school committee meetings and have these conversations, municipal broadband, you know, is very much a city challenge, right? And so I know from the district perspective, one of the things that we've been doing is purchasing these hotspots, right? So we can deliver them to our students, for those students that don't have access, so they can have access. But really, I think that this conversation now that we're now in the space of COVID-19 is really about how do we work in collaboration with the city in the context of what is needed in an academic setting to make sure that all of our kids have equality. And I think tackling broadband issues is not something that a school district can do per se, but something that the city council can really take leadership on.
How do we strengthen our school city partnerships, first of all? But analyze why we have not done it thus far.
Yeah.
And municipal broadband is not the be all and the end all. It's setting up systems and opportunities where people are reaching one another. You know, everybody has a cell phone. If that's the technology that works the best, then that's the way we use it.
Right.
Everybody, if those people that live in multifamily units, finding ways to reach them, using our interfaith community, finding people where they are, and really sort of using those opportunities to make connections, and then make people feel valued when they show up.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to jump to Ms. Curry Levette, in addition to being a parent in our school district, you also work in education as well. And so can you talk to me a little bit more about this tension between, this both and approach when it comes to the mental health and that academic piece when it comes to, our providing education to Black families during this time, this COVID-19 time?
I think what we have been finding is that those wellness checks, I 100% agree. Making sure that that is part of what people have to do every week to get a touch point, a base level about what's happening with all the young people in your building is really important. I also believe people generally do what they're accountable for. So like just saying something is a good idea, but not like putting anything behind it. Like, no, this is actually your job. I'm holding you responsible for doing that thing. Doesn't move the needle quite as much. It has to be someone's job. So I think putting meat behind those sort of well-intentioned thoughts always like gets people to do the thing. I also think it provides good data. I think a lot of times people make assumptions about particular communities. And so if you don't actually ask a person how they're doing or what's going on in their home, you don't really know. And you can use that data to inform how you resource various activities, right? So if you find 10% of your families, like they just legitimately don't have access to internet, like now we know we need to put some more money and buy some hotspots. And maybe we don't need to buy 100 hotspots. Maybe we only need 10, but we need to use that extra money for the 10 to make sure that they have what they need. If you find out 40 out of 100 families have really big issues with food insecurity, then you can take those resources and target them to where they need to be. And it creates the differentiated approach that Principal Fernandez was talking about that's necessary, instead of just like this blanket idea without any information. And it also lets the families tell you what they need versus you assuming or having a savior complex and you're just gonna come in and save the day when you're not even providing what the people want, need, have a use for. And so having those touch points gives you the right information to target resources. It also gives the people a voice to tell you the thing that would be most meaningful to them. So then you can focus on making sure that you can help them in an academic way. Like once you get that mental health or wellness check or whatever you want to call it in, and you get those resources there, then you can be able to pivot, and a teacher or a principal is able to really build the bridges that you need to do the work academically that you need. I also think parents are asking like what am I supposed to be doing? So parents have become partners in this work in a different way than they were before. Many parents were as engaged as they could be. So like, I don't want to create this narrative that like nobody was doing anything at their kids' school. No, people were engaged as much as they could be, and as much as the school system allowed them to. Having meetings in the middle of the workday means you really don't want working parents there. So like, let's be real. So parents were engaged, but now you're like actively sort of a part of the learning process. And so tools for parents to know, what am I supposed to do? How do I get on this Zoom? How do I make sure my child's doing what they're supposed to do? What are they supposed to know at the end of the year? What are they supposed to know before they start the next year? And so parents are also asking those questions so they can help their children as best they can. And so also providing parents with that information, because parents are really concerned about those things too. So parents want to know like, oh, okay, we need to make sure, like, how do I access food and my child's IEP resources and OT and all of that? And what is their grade going to look like at the end of this year? What does that mean? And so I think having those individual touch points is really key and should really be part of an expectation of how we engage with families moving forward. Like it's just good practice anyway, but using that information to inform how we make decisions. Like, don't just take it and say, oh, okay. And maybe you just help that one family, but like really bring it up on a full school level. And then a district level to say like, okay, this is how we need to allocate our resources, because a lot of times the loudest voice in a particular council meeting or something may not actually be advocating for what would be most beneficial to the families. And if you have that data, you can use that to say, oh, I'm so glad you're here, but our weekly touch points tell us that 50% of families actually need X. So we're not going to resource this thing that, you know, you're really upset about today, because we have good data to back up our decision making. And I think that's how you navigate the both and, is by being able to use those touch points, the surveys, if you have individual, you know, communities reaching out, groups that are working with young people and the data that they're collecting, like you put all of this stuff together to inform decision making, and not just let it be the people who write letters to the school committee or city council who know how to navigate the system in that particular way.
Yeah, no, I think that's really key and really important. And one thing that I've, you know, paid very close attention to since I've been on the committee, like one thing that literally drives me crazy is how we even talk about these issues, like how we even speak about Black and brown bodies in the context of education. Oftentimes it's mostly from a deficit perspective. And I think that that's really crucial in the context of COVID-19. Even when we talk about things like, you know, academic learning loss, people talk about this is going to be an extended summer and, you know, really preparing for that. And a lot of that gets projected onto Black students. And when we say that in the public sphere, then I think that there's something to this internalizing things. And I just think it's really important that as we move forward with these conversations, you know, how we even shape the narrative is really important. And one of the things I really appreciate about Sean and Principal Fernandez is that when they talk about their students, they call them scholars. You know, and what that does is it sets the narrative as it relates to how we view them. And I think that's really important, particularly at the district level, at the school level, and even in the community. You know, is really, really, really important. And how do we shift this narrative that there's only one Black experience? You know, Principal Fernandez spoke about all the different groups that's showing up. Like, those people are showing up. That means they are invested. That means that they're not absent from the conversation. And so what does that mean in the context of public education moving forward? One thing that Lavette shared with me when we were prepping for this call was, you know, a lot of families, Black families now have been forced into a situation where we are homeschooling our children. I am definitely in that camp, right? And I never envisioned myself doing that. But one thing that happened during this time, you know, I saw my child really advance in her reading skills in kindergarten. That was really, in a way that was really different from when she was in the classroom. And so I guess the conversation is moving forward. I'm curious from our panels, what does it look like for us to have conversations with our families and our community organizations around investing in the education of our children in a way that maybe we thought that we weren't positioned or prepared for before, but now that COVID's here, it's forced us into these spaces to reimagine education. So what should education look like in the context of Black kids moving forward, in the context of COVID and after we're done with this? And I would start with, let's start with Principal Fernandez.
I knew you were coming. Let me first say there was a question in the Q&A about the new normal, and are there things about the old normal that impact children and youth that we should fear? Yeah, most definitely. I think what has happened is that the again, another positive of the pandemic is it has had us throw out the old playbook. It didn't work for a lot of kids, Black and brown children on IEPs, poor children regardless of race, children with mental health issues. It didn't work for them. It didn't work for their families. And so the new normal, or the new playbook, first of all, has to be a 21st century playbook. The first thing it has to be inclusive. It has to be anti-racist. It has to be culturally proficient. It has to recognize that the children who come before us come from a variety of authentic, valid, important family backgrounds and cultural backgrounds that need to be affirmed every time they walk into the school. One of our we have a motto that is spelled scholar, and one of the in the word, in the letter O means originality. We accept our children as they come to us. Okay, we want to celebrate who they bring, within themselves and their family. So I think that the new normal has to be, first of all, we have to begin to look beyond our own experiences. Because, whether we're middle class, upper middle class, whether we're white, black, Asian, as educators and as people who are both writing policy as well as making sure policy is followed, we've got to begin to open up the tent, as they say in politics, and allow everybody to inform and impact our thinking. So what it means, a quick example, years ago, I've been around long enough that to wear a hat in a school was offensive. You didn't wear a hat. You didn't wear a hat walking in the house. You didn't wear a hat with sitting down at the table. And as I became a principal throughout all my schools, no hats. Okay. And I began to listen to the young people telling me why those hats were important to them. Some of it was a part of their identity. Some of it was because as a non-binary person, wearing a hat meant that I could be whoever I wanted to, and you're not going to classify me. It had to really sink in for me that I was bringing in my way of thinking, my 20th century way of thinking, into a 21st century setting. It's a small example, and it may not mean a big deal to a lot of people, but to that child who I said to back in 2016, okay, we can wear hats now, it changed their life in the social context of school. So we need to begin, again, going back to listening to what people have to say to us about what's working in their community, how their children feel about being in the school. And we need to think about what we're going to do if we're not in the school, and how do we differentiate our approaches with families so that everybody is on board until we open the school doors. And so I could go on, but and you know that, Ms. Bowman, but I'll stop.
Well, I think you hit it. You hit the nail on the head, because I think oftentimes in the context of education, and I'll own it too, that we project data points. We project the outcome onto kids, particularly Black kids, before they even have a chance. And that's really the key, I think, when it comes to tackling some of these challenges, in the context of COVID-19, in the current as well as afterwards. Like, how do we not project what the capabilities and the needs are, and how do we listen to our families and to our scholars, as well as encourage and push them in a time that's really challenging, because it really is a both and conversation. And I see Sean and Councilor Simmons want to jump in on this. So we'll start with Sean and then jump into Councilor Simmons.
No, I just, I want to, Mr. Fernandez, hit a lot of it on the head, and I just want to follow up to him. But I believe we should be thinking about education holistically and as non-linear. Education doesn't just occur in the classroom or Zoom meetings by licensed teachers. It's not just history, algebra, biology, etc. We all are teachers and are responsible as fathers, mothers, aunts, uncles to support our young people's education. What's important is life skills are important during this time. We've heard, from scholars just sharing how impactful it's been just to learn how to cook from his moms. And the excitement in his voice when he spoke about that was heartwarming. For that moment, there was a feeling of joy, during this crisis. He was excited to share the recipes. I think about my experiences and what I've been doing with my children during this time, one who's in high school and one who's in college. We're discussing financial literacy, banking, credit score, home ownership, and things of that nature. My wife is teaching us, how to cook some of her favorite recipes that we love. I'm giving my 15-year-old daughter driving lessons. We're including our kids in special projects around the house, home improvements, things of that nature. These are all skills that young people need and will apply well after high school and college. So really focusing on the life skills piece. But, to Mr. Fernandez, I mean, you hit it on the head with meeting our young people where they are. Their voices important. I always say, and I mean, everyone's touched on this previously, but, if you've heard me, talk, I'm always talking about the importance of young people's voice and having them involved in the design process. They are the experts of their own experiences. Let them help guide the interventions and policies that we develop. This was said, as you talk about, they should be at the table. They should not just be the beneficiaries of our programs and the decisions we make. They should be with us at the table to, adapt them, inform them, adapt them, and evaluate them. So it's just, again, it's, no, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you, Mr. Fernandez, for elevating that. I affirm you, King, for the amazing work that you're doing, with your young kings and queens.
One thing that has come out of this otherwise dark cloud, if there's any silver lining, when you talk about kids being closer to you, yeah, they're closer to you every day because they're in your house, they're not leaving. And the new things that you learn to do, you said you're teaching your daughter how to drive. Would you come teach my granddaughter? Because I don't want to do it. But I think about the things that you start doing that you weren't doing before, and it kind of speaks to some of the questions that are in our question feed that you sort of made me think of, Sean, in terms of the programs that we have in Cambridge. So one, yes, parents have to take on a new skill set or go back to the skills that they had, but they let go of. They turn their children over to the school systems. Now they see themselves more as partners. But if I could just raise Councilwoman, committee woman, say there's something in your future, committee woman Bowman, a few of the questions that are being raised. Someone specific to you, Sean, wanted to know, is becoming a man available in other districts? Let me just scroll very quickly so I can get the question directly. They wanted to know, do other children that are not in CPDSD, Cambridge Public School Department, do they have that program available?
I'm off you. So right now, in order for a young person to be involved in BAM, they would have to be in one of our 10 schools that we're in. If I may just give a quick, BAM is school-based counseling program that provides strength-based social emotional support to young men of color in grades 7 through 12. Boston,
not the middle schools at all yet?
Not yet in Cambridge, but that's the conversation that we're in with the district, is expanding into the middle schools. And pre-COVID, that was the conversations that were being had about what schools that were interested in being in. And I know Mr. Fernandez's school was one of them. So there was a lot of meetings scheduled pre-COVID that we were planning to have to expand BAM to more students than just the current students that we're serving in Cambridge, Ridge, and Latin. So right now, CRLS is the only school that we're in Cambridge, and then 9 more schools in the Boston Public Schools. But our goal, for me, is to be able to provide BAM for any young man that can use BAM. In BAM, we talk about what makes our heart hurt. And one of the things that makes my heart hurt is when I have a family member or someone who knows how valuable the program is, we can't offer it to them because they're not in one of our schools. So for me, it's about how do we provide BAM for any young man in the country that can use the service, because I stand by it wholeheartedly, not only from what we provide for our scholars, but what we provide for the men who are involved in BAM. BAM is really about men's work, ruthless self-examination, and rites of passage, and we all can use that. But for time's sake, I'll pass that to conversation for another day. But definitely look forward to having that conversation with Aisha and Manikka and you as well, Ms. Simmons.
There's another question from Elizabeth Hill, and she says, how can we as a community ensure not just a wellness checks for all, but then provide necessary supports following that wellness checks? How can we align our city's rich resources so we can address those needs, not as a savior, but as a community partner. And a reference point is Jennifer Free says, if you know of any scholars who need groceries or meals delivered, she has a contact. So just to throw that back to you, Ms. Bowman, do any of our panelists have any answers for those particular questions?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's a conversation that I've really been, I've been having it internally and engaging other people as well. Now I'll pass this to some of my colleagues here. It's just, we want to do these wellness checks, and from my vantage point as a parent and in conversation, with the district, some of that is happening, right? And so, Principal Fernandez is doing this. He knows the kids in his schools that that's checking in, that's doing the work, that's not doing the work, that's having trouble, and he's taking leadership in the context of being able to support them. My question is, whenever we, start having these, in-depth conversations around mental health, I'm very sensitive to the fact that our educators are trained to be educators and not necessarily therapists or counselors.
Right.
And so how do we, if one of them get information that they're not trained, quite frankly, to be able to manage, we don't have the infrastructure, quite frankly, set up to be able to pivot that family and the children that would be in need to the people that can actually meet their needs. And so, as we put these checks in place, I think the question for me is, like, what is the next piece to ensure that if a teacher asks me how I'm doing and I'm transparent with them about it, they don't have the skill set to be able to have an in-depth conversation with me. So how are we as a city and a district leveraging our resources to ensure that we can help our educators to make sure that they can get them to the people that are, that can give them what they need? And I think that's the work that needs to take place. And so I saw Member Wilson had her hand up, and I think that if there's anyone else that wanted to answer and dig into that.
Thank you, Vice Chair Bowman, for that. And thank you for that question to our audience. I think the important piece is really leveraging our relationships with our community partners. And I think that for a city as rich as Cambridge, as district rich or resource rich as we are, we don't do that very well at all. There are so many community partners out here that work with our young people. We have the middle school network, we have the Reaching All Youth for the high school, and we don't do a good job of how we're able to have transparent conversations with our teachers about our scholars, right? And then that could be for confidentiality reasons. And I can only speak for myself as a workforce teacher counselor that being in the high school, I have so much now privilege of being able to facilitate conversations and be that liaison who's like in between a teacher, a scholar, and the family, and being able to say, these are some of the things that are happening. How do we help to, provide some resources in? And I'm happy to have those connections in that resource. And I'm also happy that we have the MOU or MOA to have that communication, right? A lot of our other programs don't have that opportunity. And that's something I know the district is working on, and we need to work on that fast, because we do know that many of our young scholars are involved and engaged in community partner programs, and then yet we're not able to translate that information to the schools to say, this is what's happening at home. I knew a year ago, just to give a quick story, I had a young person in the housing authority. We're renovating our units often, and families have to move at the drop of a dime or whatever. Young scholars have to be living out of boxes for a month because they were told a month ago they're moving. And then all of a sudden, boom, on the day of the move, it's like they're out of school for 2 or 3 days. And teachers don't know why, because there's been a lack of communication divide. But I've been able to share that, like, this is what's happening. And it's not like the young person is just MIA. These are the things that are happening and how we can help this family to get back on track with this move and everything. It's just we're not doing a great job of including our community partners in these conversations and having the seat at the table. And this is why I'm very much appreciative to the Agenda for Children, Out of School Time Network, MSN, and then I also wanted to touch on something a little bit earlier around our other communities, and specifically for Black families. When we talk about the NAACP, when we talk about the My Brother's Keeper, the building equity bridges, the Educators of Color Coalition, the Equity Fellows, like all of these groups that are really helping and supporting families of color or educators of color, and how we could work together as a community. Our voices need to align, because at the end of the day, Black people in Cambridge, we're whether we're a large population or not, we don't come together enough to really share our voices and experiences as a collective. And that's where the challenge is and the division is, because we're all over the place with who to reach out to, our spiritual groups, our networks of this and our networks of that. And somehow we need to have more community, more conversations like this, but at greater scales, to really make sure that we're joining those forces for our families, and knowing and allowing our families to know that there is space, there is opportunity, they have voice, and that we need to hear them and we need to support them. And that's my job. And I will make that promise that as a school committee, as an elected official, that I want to make sure that I'm reaching out to all of our families, specifically our underserved and underprivileged families, to make sure that they have all of their needs met. And my heart goes out to our kids on IEPs who are not getting those services and needs met from a remote standpoint, because that's unacceptable, right? And we need to be doing more to really service our kids to the best of the abilities, but understanding that through this virtual world that we're currently in, that's something we can't take into the new normal. You know, when we get over COVID, we need to make sure that our resources are that we're able to tap into it, and make sure that all of our scholars can hit their expectations each and every year as they continue through our public schools.
Yeah, and I think Member Wilson, one of the reasons why, myself and Councilor Simmons, like when we saw the devastating impact that the COVID-19 was having on our community. And, it's so vital and so important that we come together at this time, because this is life and death right now. It really is. And how we have conversations and how we engage our community and how we share information matters so much now. And so this is why it's really important for us to gather and have conversations, get on the same page, discuss the issues, and really be able to influence all the different power structures that will position our families, because it is like this thing is hitting us so incredibly hard. And, we really do. You're absolutely right. We have to come together. I see the time, it's a rich conversation. This is part one of a 5-part series that I look forward to continuing the conversation. And so if we could take just 2 minutes for each person, what should Black families be thinking about in the context of education and their families as we move forward with surviving during COVID-19? Black communities, we know something about survival and even in tough situations. Like, it is so much a part of our history in the United States of America. And we want to move beyond that one day. That's my prayer. That's my hope, that our journey in this city, as well as in this country, is not that we have to struggle and thrive through adversity, that we can have the same privileges that other communities have and just be, right? But that's not where we're at right now. And so how do we move forward when it comes to the context of education, knowing that COVID-19 is impacting us in really challenging ways? I'll start with Lavette, and recognizing 1 minute per person, please, because we have to wrap it up.
I think one thing that's important for Black families to remember during this time and to think about is that there's an opportunity here for us to think differently, and you should use your voice. And I would also say that we should force the system to change. The system was very nimble during this time period. So things that people said were impossible have now become possible overnight. Yes. And so a no should not be the end anymore. If you have a feeling about what is best for your child, or what's best for your child, to use your voice and know that the system can move a lot faster than they said they could. Yeah. And to use that information to continue to advocate that we can do school differently, and we can do school in a way that meets the needs of every child if we just operate differently and are open to new ideas.
Thank you. Let's go to Member Wilson.
Thank you. I would say, just as a a reminder for our families, that public school systems were not built or designed for Black families, right? And so we really have to dismantle what that looks like, and we need to do that as a collective. We really need to. I'm blessed to have the opportunity to have a seat at the table and understand that if I didn't have this seat at the table of being a school committee member, that I would be bringing my own chair to this table. And that's what we need to be encouraging our families to be doing and empowering them to do in order to uplift their voices and uplift their experiences of what they are going through at this time as a collective, that we utilize our resources, that we utilize the NAACP, that we utilize the My Brother's Keeper, and that we utilize Building Equity Bridges. These are great programs that are joining families and joining the community together in great ways, and that we need to really join in those spaces and understand more and hear from our immigrant families who are not able to access and leverage many of the resources because of language barriers, right? And so it's really important that we are in that space together and that we're able to outreach, but that we're able to join as a collective. And so I want to see that for our families. I want to see that as the way that we empower to uplift voices, that we learn from, the elected officials, that we're able to bring us to your tables, and have those conversations with you to say, these, to hear from you on what you need so that we can better do our jobs at pushing our district to do better. Because my whole thing is together, we are better. And I am a true believer in that, but we have to be able to come together in order to do so.
Thank you. Thank you, Member Wilson. Sean, what do you have for us?
I believe I spoke to this earlier about just the holistic approach, but what I would say after hearing, Aisha, speak, and others is, and I think I said this before, is, I'm often reminded of something President Obama said when I had an opportunity to participate in MBK Alliance Town Hall, and that is, if, during crisis, we don't fill some of these gaps, nobody else is going to. And when I say we, that means parents, that means, educators, that means community. We're losing, and only we can, help our young people, our community come out of this. So my lead will be, if you can't do a whole lot, then do a whole little. And before you know it, you've had a great impact. And I'll leave with that.
Thank you. Principal Fernandez.
First of all, I agree with everything that everybody has said. I think building community, that is key. I think thinking differently, that it didn't work before, but guess what? We can make it work now. But I think one of the things that's really important as we move forward, whether we go back to school in September or whether we go back to school in January or beyond, we're going to be, we need trauma-informed classrooms, trauma-informed policies, trauma-informed support. We talk about, I lift up the superintendent and the district last year responding to our call that we needed another guidance counselor. I am fortunate in our building to have 3 guidance counselors and a family liaison who teachers then refer information to regularly during this pandemic. They are working 7 days a week. When you're in crisis and you're in the 7th grade, you don't say, well, it's 4 o'clock, so I'm not going to call her now. They're calling at 9 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
And our counselors and staff are responding to their needs. We need to get ready for that. We're not ready for it now. We're not adequately prepared to respond to what they're bringing to us today. I can only imagine what it's going to be like as we move forward in the summer, when school shuts down, in September, in the fall, and on into winter. How do we help these children cope? And that's the most important, is if they don't cope, you can forget about learning. And like Ms. Curry said earlier, they're not changing the standards 5 years down the road.
Yeah.
So we better change some things today. And thank you.
Thank you. And, I just want to take some time and just recognize that the field of education changed like that overnight. And it's true, things that we said we would never be able to do, we're literally doing it now. And I just want to acknowledge, the educators, our principal that is here, one of our principals that's here, that leaned into that challenge. It is definitely has not been perfect, but I definitely see what can happen when people put their energy and their intentions and their minds together to achieve something for our young people in crisis. And we'll keep working at it. And that's what we have to do. But I just wanted to just acknowledge, I know that there are some educators right now that's watching this, and just let them know that they're fully seen and appreciate the work and the pivot that they had to do in order to meet the needs of young people in our district. And some we got some of it right and some of it we didn't, and we're going to learn, we're going to grow, and we're going to rise to the occasion. So Councilor Simmons, what do you have for us?
Well, first of all, this has been amazing. You said, what can we do next? We should do this again. I feel like we're out of time, and we're just warming up. There's so much more we can talk about. And one of the questions that sort of came in toward the end was, what was the role of the school committee in distance learning, and what were they doing for the immigrant population? And I know that you, Ms. Bowman, and you, Ms. Wilson, work all the time, overtime, every time, trying to reach those communities, and it's an ongoing issue that you look at and you give all your attention. I have to say, this is just wonderful. It makes me hopeful. It makes me hopeful that even though we have this crisis, that we will, I don't know who said it, says, gee, all of a sudden we can seem to do things that we weren't able to do now. So now we have to hold people accountable.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Hold them accountable to making sure that we don't roll back to business as usual.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, that question is perfectly timed because I have some slides that's going to be queued up right now as we close out to give people information, because I believe information is power as it relates to some of the work that's happening in our district. And so as those slides are being prepped to come up, we will also have them on the website for CCTV. But this shows what the district has been doing in the context of COVID-19. And so I want to highly recommend that people go to our website and really go. We have a whole section that's designed for COVID-19 and the response. Our initial response was really being able to take care of the social, emotional needs of students and make sure that they had things like hotspots, right? So the next piece, you can keep going. And the slides show the efforts of what take place. But the piece that I really want to highlight for people is what's next is the next slide down. That we are in the process of looking ahead to, summer learning and supports and to planning for the school year. And so often, people ask, how do I have a seat at the table, right? Well, this is how you have a seat at the table. We will be having a task force. It's a motion that was unanimously passed at the school committee level to make sure that we're tapping our community members and also the thought leadership in Cambridge, because we know that we have some of the most dynamic leaders in the world right here in our city, to create that task force so we can make sure that we are positioning our schools to come back in a way that's healthy for our staff, our families, and our students. So if you're interested in being a part of that, please email our district. The email is at the bottom of the slide, and CCTV will put that up on the website for you. But it's if you go to the website, it is there. The second piece that I think is really important is this planning aspect. And so we have the task force, but we also have working groups that the superintendent is leading. So please email our district if you want to be a part of that. But the other piece that's really important as it relates to policy making, our subcommittees will be the place where the public can come and have conversations and shape some of the policy making that then will be referred to the committee as a whole, so we can have votes on what's the direction that we'll be going in. Those are the places that if you want to have influence and just be in conversation with community leaders, school committee members like Member Wilson and myself, as well as the superintendent, that's the places where that happens. And so if you go to our website, cpsd.us, there's a link there that gives you access to our school committee schedules and when meetings will happen. I go back to this: information is power, And those are the places where the conversations are had to shape how we move forward as a community. So please go to the website, email the superintendent, email myself and Member Wilson. We are here for you to hear what you have to say as it relates to how we reimagine school moving forward, and also prepare for the challenging task of reopening our schools in the context of COVID-19, which could be a whole nother episode in this series, because that is a significant conversation. And I have to say this before we sign off, Sean, based on your recommendation, I think we should add another part to this series that really center youth voice. And so we're going to do it. Like, it's just going to happen. So stay tuned. The series may not end at this point.
Absolutely. Love it.
So before we close, I also want to remind us that if you like this, then join us in 2 weeks. We're going to be following this discussion. And our next discussion is going to be on June 7th at 1:00. And we will be talking about COVID-19 and it's how it is impacting healthcare access and outcomes in the Black community. And our scheduled speakers and the lineup is looking pretty good. Claude Jacob is our Chief Public Health Officer, will be speaking. Dr. Zenia Johnson Bembe, who's an Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at the Cambridge Health Alliance, will be speaking. Dr. Jeanette Callahan, Pediatric Specialist at the Cambridge Health Alliance. And we have a couple of other speakers that will be speaking. It'll be really a nice coming together, because you started so heavily, particularly you, Mr. Fernandez, and you, Mr. Brown, when you started talking, and I think you did too, Sister Wilson, talked about the social emotional impact of COVID-19 and on the African American community. So I look forward to having you all tune in to watch that and follow and continue our discussion. So thank you, all of you. And I have to say thank you to Sean, and so Susan and Sean and Maritza for making this, and Neil for making this all happen.
Yes, thank you, CCTV, for being a major partner in this effort and really centering the voices of Black people in a way that I think is kind of unique as it relates to how we have conversations here in Cambridge. So thank you so much for that. And we will continue the conversation. And I want to let everyone know that over the next 2 weeks, this program will be running on Channel 9 on CCTV. So if you want to let people know that we've started this series and want to view this program, you will have access to it on CCTV for the next 2 weeks. And we will follow that same model for every program that we put in place moving forward. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Councilor Simmons, for agreeing to be in partnership, on this venture. And I'm really excited to see where these conversations will lead us as a community. So thanks so much, everyone. I'll take it. Thank you.
Vice Chair Bowman and Councilor Simmons, thank you all so much for just having the spaces for these conversations, and then inviting us for being a part of this critical one around education for our Black kids, Black scholars. Thank you.
Black scholars.
Kings and queens.
Kings and queens. Absolutely.
Kings and queens. Yeah.
Take care of yourselves and each other.
Likewise.
Be well, everyone,
Bye.
and join us in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.